For the next 2 hours, all you need is a story and rest. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced.
Move the fence, and time follows.
Hold. Correct. Forget.
No spectacle, only competence, dressed as kindness.
This city is tuned by sympathy, not decree.
I remember him on the 6th day.
For the next 2 hours, your only task is to listen and rest.
I was 19 when I learned the sound a secret makes. It isn't thunder. It isn't the flourish of trumpets announcing revelation. It is paper exhaling in a room with no windows, a hush that feels like the breath of something older than breath itself, as if parchment could remember being skin and chose out of mercy not to scream. They told me silence was sacred. Later, I would learn it was enforced. But on the first night I descended beneath the apostolic library, I believed everything they told me, the way the newly devout believe a sunrise owes them warmth. They called our little house the novitiate of the watchful hours, though nothing about those hours felt little. The name did not appear on official rolls or on the plaques tourists adored. Our vows were 3. Guard the books, correct the clocks, erase your name. The third vow sounded poetic when I first heard it. The elder who spoke it smelled faintly of beeswax and mineral ink, and he had a way of smiling at the end of a sentence as if punctuation were a personal joke. Erase your name, he said, and a few of us boys, too proud of our new humility, nodded solemnly. I thought it meant to be modest, to bow before truth, to keep the self out of the holy archive. I was, in those days, still fluent in the language of beautiful mistakes. To reach our duties, we passed the iron gate that most eyes mistake for a decorative flourish, and we took a staircase mapped by constellations instead of numbers. Each turning was a star, each landing a zodiac wound. Brass nails hammered into stone formed a thin, glimmering path, Perseus pointing to a locked door, Virgo resting above a sunken lintel, Capricorn, where the steps changed harmonics and the faint clatter of chains added itself to the air like a second, secret breath. The elders called this rising chorus the library's lungs. Old buildings do have lungs, their drafts inhale and exhale patience. Down there, patience felt like a pressure, as if the stones themselves were weighing our hearts and recording the measure. Our first lessons were practical. A lamp can hiss the way an admonishing teacher hisses, so keep it trimmed. The leather binding on a chained book will outlast your bones if you oil it each season, so treat your hands as vessels for the oil and not the masters of it. The brass key with the star-shaped bow belongs only to the door whose lintel is carved with a lamb's unfed gaze. Never try it in another lock, not because you will fail. Several locks below, accept it in a half-hearted way, but because each successful disobedience teaches the building you are willing to bargain with it. We were told the building could be bargained with. We were told not to try. The elder I shadowed most closely was a man called Paulus, only when someone important needed to know he existed. The rest of us called him what he called himself. Custos, the keeper. He never told me his age. Certain faces are maps for which there is no legend. wrinkles that pretend to be roads toward a city you will never actually reach. He walked without sound and spoke without haste. People mistake the unhurried for the gentle, but he could cut a sentence to bone when he wanted. He liked to say, "If you must hurry, hurry slowly," and then he'd hand me the blackened quill that had signed coronations generations ago, and he'd show me how to copy a title onto a slip of paper in the angled hand the subterranea demanded. Sit too near to a page, and it will fog with your breath. Sit too far, and the lamp will conspire with your shadow to hide the annotation you need. Hurry slowly, he'd say again, and I would realize that phrase translates, in the grammar of the archive, to live here, not in the next room of your thoughts. That night, the one that split my life into before and after, he guided me through a corridor where the walls leaned inward, not from subsidence, but from a kind of curiosity. Stone can be curious. We passed a niche that held a bell which never rang for the living. We passed a statue whose eyes had been left unfinished, as if the sculptor refused to teach it how to accuse us properly. The air changed from the smell of dust and vellum to something metallic and sweet, like the ghost of wine in a chalice that had not been washed for a century. The floor fell slightly beneath our feet. The breathing of the library became a long, slow sigh. Tonight you will copy, and you will not understand what you copy, Custos said matter-of-factly. Understanding is a privilege, accuracy is a vow. I nodded too quickly. Young nods are always too quick. The head eager to pretend it is caught up with the heart. He set a small wooden box on a lectern. Its lid bore a faded sigil, a wing with a broken pinion. When my fingers brushed that sigil, I felt a pull behind my eyes, as if a thread had tightened and asked me to follow it backward into a story. "This," Custos said, almost gently, "is a student's notebook. It will teach you our grammar. It will teach you our speed." He undid the clasp. Inside lay a goatskin notebook, salted pale at the edges, the way old bindings learn to mimic the sea. It smelled like rain on limestone and something else, the faintest iron tang I couldn't name, not then. I know the name now. If you've ever cut your finger and lifted it to your mouth out of reflex and then paused because the taste of yourself startled you, you know the taste. It is memory, dried and woken by breath. The first page carried no signature. The title, written in an elegant, almost reluctant hand, read, "The Lost Diary of an Angelic Novice." Beneath it, a motto in smaller script. "If memory is a kingdom, borders are drawn with fear." I copied the title onto a slip as instructed. The quill moved like a needle through cloth. The lamp hummed. Somewhere beyond the curve of the corridor, a chain clinked and settled, and, after that, for a long time, nothing else moved, only the slow evaporation of a long-kept secret finding its way through me. I was told to copy only the headings that night. Heading after heading, each like a scab you are dying to pick. To enter the vault of halos and shadows, speak the stars backward. No page numbers followed that directive. Then, on the chaining of books and the respirations thereof. Then, a note on the astral clock and the winter that did not occur. Then, an index of obedient contradictions. The phrases entered me like pins, fastening a shape I could not yet see. I obeyed and did not turn beyond the headings. I obeyed and counted how many times the author used the passive voice to hide a hand that must have been shaking. I obeyed, and the act of obedience rearranged my lungs, made space in them for a kind of air I had not breathed before. Custos left me there after a while, trusting the lamp, trusting the chains that measure the movement of readers the way a guard might measure a sleeper's breath. "If you finish the headings, sort these slips," he said, laying a small stack beside me, each labeled with a saint's name struck through in red and rewritten in brown beneath it. Saint X to be celebrated on Y. Saint Z to be remembered only in region Q. The handwriting on those slips was an argument pretending not to be an argument. Even the ink colors had been chosen to demonstrate civility. Red said correction. Brown said consent. But it was only paint on a theater set. I knew that much already without understanding how I knew it. It is easy, in memory, to pretend you were always suspicious. The truth is more embarrassing. I loved it. I loved the precision, the liturgy of carefulness, the way a chain's faint clink can persuade the blood to slow so that the mind can drink more deeply. We do not fall in love only with people. Often we fall in love with how rooms arrange our attention. The subterranea arranged me. It taught me where to put my eyes, and how to narrow them, and when to widen them. Like any lover, it hinted at hidden rooms and promised, if I was good, I could sleep there someday. When I reached the heading on the chaining of books and the respirations thereof, I paused long enough that the lamp's flame bowed upward as if to see what I would do. A sensible novice would copy and move on. A dutiful one would note the reference number and avoid the temptation of subheadings. A 19-year-old who had never yet betrayed his own curiosity would place a fingertip in the seam and tilt the page just enough that the lamp's light might trespass a little farther than permitted. I was all three of those boys, arguing in a narrow corridor with lungs made of stone. I tilted. The margin held a single line in newer ink, "Chain the question, not the book." And beneath it, in the older hand, the one I already knew belonged to the Angelic Novice. A question in chains becomes an altar. The sentence landed on me with the weight of a coin dropped into a still basin. The ripples took their time. Every rule I had been given was still intact, serene on its shelf. Nothing had been smashed or shouted at, but the room had changed shape around me, and I had changed shape within it, and though no alarm sounded, a door I had not seen before remembered it had a hinge. I did not read further. I tell you this, not to prove my virtue, but because I know where the story worsens, and it does not worsen here. It worsens the way winter worsens, not with one blizzard, but with the decision to store wood in August because you can hear a rumor in the birds. The rumor I heard that night was not thunder. It was a page inhaling. The page would have liked to ask me for something extravagant, but it knew my economy. It asked me only to remember that sentence. I did. I still do. On my second week in the watchful hours, time became a tool rather than an ocean. I had been a swimmer. They made me a surveyor. The astral clock of the long night sat beneath a dome whose acoustics turned whispers into counsel. Brass rings carried the names of seasons in a language that sometimes pretended to be Latin when a tourist was near, and sometimes forgot the pretense entirely when a true reader approached. If you aligned the rings as the handwritten instructions demanded, never the printed ones. The printed ones were for show. The calendar performed a slow rotation that caused feast days to walk themselves across centuries, the way chess pieces obey a thumb and forefinger. I learned to turn the rings in a rhythm that pleased the mechanism. I learned where the faint scratch marks on the brass confessed the habits of vanished keepers, and how the tiny notch in the winter ring meant someone had once used a knife to hurry an inconvenient day out of its alignment. Doesn't the sky complain? I asked Custos when my youth made me absurd. He didn't laugh. He seldom laughed. He answered as if the question were not absurd at all. "The sky is generous," he said. "It has room for several versions of itself. We choose the one that keeps pilgrims arriving in orderly months." He smoothed the winter ring with a thumb that had smoothed 1,000 surfaces and had never altered one by a single hair's breadth. "Chaos converts no one," he said. "Conversion loves a schedule. The diary, yes, by then it was the diary. Title and authority rolling into each other had a section on the clock. I still had not been granted permission to read beyond headings, but permission is a kind of weather, and weather makes windows complain. In a footnote I glimpsed before I closed the page properly. The novice wrote, "Time is a shepherd. Move the fence. The flock follows." I followed that line with my eyes, even as I turned the page back and placed the brass marker where Custos expected it. That is how you begin to betray a house of worship, by learning its scent and loving it too much to stay only in the nave. By the end of the first month, I lived in 2 rooms within 1 corridor. In the official room I copied headings, oiled leather, checked the chains for fatigue, logged the faint breathing of vellum as if it were the pulse of a convalescent. In the room behind the room I kept a private index of phrases the diary let slip when I moved in the correct rhythm. Sanctify or smother. Clean hands leave the deepest stains. If the shepherd changes, let the flock see only the staff. I wrote the phrases on my skin in lemon juice, the way a child plays spy, though I would have died rather than call it a game. In sunlight, they vanished. In candlelight, they returned like small resurrections. I touched them sometimes to be sure I had not imagined them. The skin remembers differently than the mind. The mind edits, the skin does not. A corridor we called the Whispering Wall began to court my curiosity, not by noise but by restraint. Statues there kept their faces turned to stone, as if embarrassed by their own expressions. Once a year, on a feast day that the newer calendars preferred to forget, a fine vapor fogged the marble mouths. I had never been allowed near on that day. I had seen only the traces after the faint damp that made dust clump into larger, more patient dust. The diary named that corridor with a tenderness I had not heard the novice use elsewhere. A place where stone becomes lung for the names we cannot carry openly. I copied the phrase, and then, ashamed of the intimacy, I scratched over it with a safer note about chain maintenance so that, should Custos happen upon my slip, I could pretend my handwriting had only admired the curve of the letter S and not the meaning it had chosen to hold. Custos did not happen upon my slips. He happened upon me. He found me alone with the box one night, the lamp trimmed too bright for the hour, my pupils stubbornly wide, as if I were trying to admit an alphabet that had not consented to exist yet. He placed one finger on the notebook's edge, a gesture that was both warning and blessing. "Accuracy," he said, "precedes understanding." I nodded, because nodding was, then, my second vocation. He lifted the finger. "Understanding," he added, "precedes courage." I did not nod. He allowed himself the smallest of near smiles, an eclipse of a smile, and courage must learn to arrive late. He left me there, alone enough to be honest, guarded enough to stay that way. Why am I telling you all of this? Because a confession that begins with fireworks and leaps straight to the betrayal of an oath is not a confession. It is advertising. The first sin I committed here was not reading what I had not been permitted to read. It was falling in love with the craft of not reading, with the choreography of restraint the keepers had perfected. I learned to pause at thresholds with my whole body, to linger my breath just behind my teeth when a page wanted to be turned. I learned the trick of counting spines while thinking about clocks, and of counting clock ticks while thinking about saints whose names had been struck through and rewritten in a hand that wanted to be anonymous and failed. Secrecy is not the absence of telling. It is a different grammar of telling. I became fluent in that grammar long before I spoke a single forbidden word aloud. The first time the diary spoke as if it knew I was listening, yes, spoke. Pages speak the way windows speak in a storm. When the house would rather they didn't. I had just finished retying the leather collar around a collection of star charts whose errors were devotional rather than astronomical. Someone long ago had preferred a beautiful map to a true one, and then had repented into ugliness. My fingers were stiff. I closed the chart too firmly. The clasp complained. The lamp scolded. I turned back to the notebook to copy the next heading and found, in the far margin, a tiny diagram I had not noticed before. A wing pinned to a board. Not a drawing of a wing in flight, not a poet's idea of uplift, but a specimen, labeled with careful letters at each vein, a tiny dotted line indicating where the pin should enter to hold the thing still without tearing it. Beneath the diagram, a single sentence. When they call you angel, check your shoulders for staples. I laughed. An involuntary, small, disobedient laugh that sounded obscene in that corridor. The sound startled me. It felt like I had offered my voice to a room that preferred the whisper of maps. I smothered the laugh with my palm, and then, because I am honest at least about the small humiliations, I kissed the sentence with my eyes closed. The kiss wasn't devotion. It was gratitude for the way words can rescue us from the theater of what we believe about ourselves. I did not want to be an angel. I wanted to be allowed to keep my name. That night, I understood the third vow differently. Erase your name, yes, but also, if you are not careful, consent to someone else's name being pinned to you with a staple. There are schools of discipline that teach subtraction. The novitiate of the watchful hours taught addition. It added layers, a posture, a cadence, a palette of inks, a taxonomy of paper breaths, until the person wearing them became indistinguishable from the work being done. If you had asked me then what the work was, I would have said something beautiful and naive about preserving truth from the weather. The weather, it turns out, is more honest than the hand that claims to shelter us from it. Rain does not pretend to be wine. Wind does not boast of being prayer. We did both in that corridor. We renamed erosion as liturgy. We called an editorial decision a miracle. I have been careful not to show you the worst doors too soon. You will walk through them with me, but not yet. Chapter 1 is for anatomy, not autopsy. You must know where the nerves lie before you can describe the wound. So, I will end this hour where my apprenticeship truly began. With a penitent smallness I mistook for virtue, with the delicious precision of tasks that keep terror at a generous distance, and with a page that asked only to be remembered and was, by a boy who believed that remembering was harmless. The elder had told me to hurry slowly. I hurried so slowly that the library had time to recognize my footsteps and learn to love me back. That was the danger. Buildings that love us grow jealous of our futures. They give us just enough light to choose the wrong door carefully. Near dawn, I set the quill down. The lamp narrowed its hum as if to signal contentment. The chain around the star charts settled into a posture I had learned to trust. I returned the goatskin notebook to its box and watched my hand hesitate over the broken wing sigil. I wanted to trace it. I wanted to press my finger into the worn groove and feel the pressed history of the other fingers that had wanted the same. I did neither. I placed the lid gently, as if silence could be tucked in and told to sleep, and I sat with my palms open on the lectern until the breath of the building matched the breath in my chest. On the walk back to our cell, Custos fell into step beside me. He did not ask what I had seen. He did not ask if I had disobeyed. He did not have to. "The first sound you heard tonight," he said, "you will hear again." I looked at him, foolish and earnest. "What sound?" He considered an answer and spared me a metaphor. "Paper," he said simply. "Remember it." We stepped into the corridor where statues looked at the wall, and the air smelled faintly of something that might have been memory, or might have been dust. "Erase your name," he reminded me at the threshold, as if finishing a sentence he had started years before I was born, "and write it somewhere only fire can see." He left me there, between obedience and its echo, with lemon juice drying invisible in the crook of my elbow, and a sentence printed in my bones that no later ritual would succeed in cutting out. I slept that morning the way sleepers do after the first honest fear, on my back, hands open, as if I had surrendered something without knowing what it was. Perhaps I had. Perhaps surrender is simply the first grammar lesson in a language where questions are not answers but altars. I tell you this so that when we reach the vault, when we speak the stars backward, when I show you the clock and the winter that did not occur, you will not think a boy ripped a veil with a shout and found a conspiracy lying clean and naked beneath it. Nothing here was naked. Everything wore vestments chosen with exquisite care. We do not unrobe such care with outrage. We undress it with attention, and attention, properly trained, can be the sharpest of knives. I had not yet learned to wield it, but the handle was already warm in my hand. Outside, the ordinary hour assembled itself. A bell that had never rung for the living pretending to be punctual. The scrape of a broom across flagstones older than the kingdom that pretended to own them. A gull crying, as if Rome still had a sea at its door. My name, which I had vowed to erase, sat obediently in my mouth like a host I might have swallowed if someone had asked me politely. No one asked. The day began. Somewhere, above and far away, tourists took pictures of saints facing the Sunday. Below, the saints I knew pressed their faces to the wall and waited for the one feast day nobody was supposed to remember. I waited with them, not because I knew what I was waiting for, but because the page had breathed, and once you hear that sound, you keep your ear close to the dark, and you promise yourself you will breathe when it breathes. And you do, until the moment comes when both of you inhale too deep, and something that has slept for centuries opens its eyes. That would not happen for a while. For now, the lesson was simple. Accuracy precedes understanding. Understanding precedes courage. Courage must learn to arrive late. I arranged the sentence like a rosary I could count in the dark. I had no idea that by counting it, I was inviting it to count me back. I did not enter the hall of chains the way a thief enters a house. I entered the way a nurse enters a ward at night, with careful hands, with a lamp shaded to spare the patient's eyes, with a practiced indifference to the whispers that do not belong to her. We were taught to think of the volumes as convalescents, and of ourselves as attendants to their breath. That is how the keepers made our work sound kind. Cruelty often dresses in the cap and apron of care. The corridor that led to the hall narrowed until it seemed to measure my shoulders, the ceiling lowered by the thickness of a single vow. Every third stone in the floor bore a nailhead like a star brass worn warm by 1,000 discreet heel turns. The nearer I drew, the more the air learned a rhythm that did not answer to my lungs. It was the steady respiration of vellum and leather, and links of iron cooling and warming with the capricious moods of subterranean drafts. I have heard cathedrals breathe when snow melts. This was different. This was the breath of a patient who will not die and will not consent to be discharged. Custos unlocked the grating with the star-bowed key and did not step across the threshold. "You go," he said. "Hurry slowly." He stood with his hands folded, making a door out of himself that I had already passed through. The lock's throat cleared. The grating swung inward like a hinge on an old injury. I went in. Chains hung from oak rails in looped garlands. They were not cruel, not as anyone would define cruelty in a court of law. Each chain was sized to the spine it served, affixed by a collar that distributed weight evenly and bit into nothing. The collars were embossed with numerals and with small reliefs: a hand, a star, a sheaf of wheat, a physician's cup, an instrument that looked like a spyglass trying to become a crozier. The symbols were a code for those who could no longer bear to see letters wearing masks. In their unison they made a sound like cautious rain. "Oil," Custos said, passing me a small bottle. 3 points only. The rest the brass remembers. I nodded. We do not think of metal as remembering until we see the exact way a link returns to its comfortable fall after each lift. Habit is a species of memory. The hall was crowded with it. The first lectern held a compilation with an immodest title in a modest script: Devotiones Mirabilium. The binding had been rebacked twice, the second reback concealing the first, the way a lie sometimes hides another lie out of professional courtesy. I had been taught to read such histories with my fingertips. The leather there felt like a place where a hand had learned to apologize. I eased the book open and met an index that changed the names of things without confessing it had done so. An eclipse catalog recast as a ladder of omens. A surgeon's casebook reborn as a reliquary of intercessions, each remedy relabeled petition granted. Moon dark became the Lent of the sky. Compound tincture became saintly favor. Wind in the Tiber that scattered fever-slick exhalations became Michael's wing. The more I read, the more the book's humility sounded like theater. Not every conversion of term to term was dishonest. Some physicians need the language of blessing, the way some prayers need the language of chemistry. But the accumulation, do you understand the danger of accumulation? 1 brick is not a wall. 100 bricks are not a prison. Then one morning you find a single aperture left for sunlight and call it grace. This accumulation altered the floor under my feet. I turned to the margin notes. Someone had annotated the annotations. Brown ink in the hand of an obedient editor. Make the cure instructive to devotion. Red ink in a different hand, feminine and impatient. Make devotion instructive to cure. Between those 2 sentences lay a truce I could almost believe in. But truce is not peace, and truce does not educate truth. It only keeps it presentable. The second lectern held a series of folios sealed in beeswax. Each bore a medallion, a sun whose rays divided into equal teeth gear and halo married at last. A slip beside them read, "In the gentle language our order preferred when it wished to be cruel. Index of Obedient Contradictions." My breath misplaced itself for a moment. I had seen a reference to this index in the diary's headings and had reproduced the phrase on a lemon-ghosted strip of skin under my sleeve. Now the thing itself lay in reach, trembling slightly in the lamp's draught like a promise deciding whether to keep itself. I warmed the wax with my palm until the seal loosened in a manner that could later be called inevitability. The first sheet displayed a device that pulled starlight closer than sight deserved. Not quite a telescope, not quite a rosary reduced to brass. Below the drawing, a line in small hand. "If seeing is scandal, we will teach the lens to pray." The notion made me ache. I had not yet earned the right to grieve this kind of ache. It was the ache of a question being laundered into an object. I wanted to hear the question cry. I turned another page. A drawing of what any child would now call a pump simple, artless, effective. The caption renamed it "Relic of the Well at Cana." Clever, vicious. A miracle liquefied into engineering retroactively, or engineering baptized until everything it made looked like wine. Choose your direction. The ritual performs the same obedience. The red ink hand had returned, angry as a teacher at the bell. Sanctify or smother, that was the index's mission. That was the algorithm wearing cassock. If a contradiction cannot be tutored into kneeling, refuse it a name until it starves. "Copy," Custos said from the doorway, as if nothing of consequence were occurring. I copied. I rendered each line faithfully. Accuracy precedes understanding. Understanding precedes courage. Courage must learn to arrive late. The chain gave one patient hiss as I shifted the folio to spare its spine. I noticed the chain had been lengthened by 3 links sometime in the last century. The new iron was a shade less resigned. My fingertips came away with the confidence of oil and a grain of beeswax like a freckle. Midway down the hall, a case held things that looked like insects pinned under glass, but were only ideas archived in the manner of insects. Diagrams of arguments, theorems, with their wings outspread to show where the logic-thin membranes were frailest. Each bore a small pinprick at a vein where the diagram's motion could be halted without tearing it. "When they call you angel, check your shoulders for staples," the diary had told me. These were not angels, but the same grammar had been applied. The affixing of wonder to a board. I said a foolish thing. "We preserve them," I told Custos, as if my mouth had borrowed the museum's tone. "We keep them from harm." He did not answer. He adjusted a lamp wick a fraction. He watched the smoke teach the air to braid itself around the light. "We preserve their uses," he said at last. "Harm is a draft. Everything lives inside one. Sometimes I wished he would lie to me just a little, just to let me hate him cleanly. But he told the unhandsome truths, with a voice so calm I wanted to sleep inside it. That is a danger, too." Toward the back of the hall stood a lectern lower than the rest, built for someone who sat while reading an accommodation or a penance. A chain as delicate as a couturier's tape fastened a narrow book to the rail. The title, gilded so faintly the letters existed only when the lamp blinked a certain way, read, "On the Proper Education of Doubt." I laughed out of surprise, the way I had laughed in Chapter 1 at the pinned wing. A book for doubt, the way a catechism is for belief. The first page listed lessons. Doubt must never arrive alone. Pair it with a miracle. Teach doubt to love decency more than accuracy. If doubt insists on facts, make the facts obsolete by calendar. The curriculum felt like a man teaching his enemy table manners to make the duel more picturesque. At the bottom of the page, a note in the old angelic hand. Do not chain truth. Chain the mirror that makes it look unflattering. I can still taste the lemon and copper of the moment I copied that sentence onto my skin. I have been accused later by a listener more impatient than kind of painting too many rooms before pointing to the fire. But the Hall of Chains was not one room. It was an architecture of police work disguised as pastoral care. Its effectiveness lay in the way it invited you to help. You do not burn what you have oiled. You do not steal what you have indexed. You do not shout against a system that lets you correct its punctuation. I corrected punctuation that night. I straightened a tag. I made a chain lie more comfortably so the pages would not bruise where the collar pressed. Sanctify or smother, said the red hand. Hurry slowly, said Custos. Erase your name, said the vow. And the diary, patient and impolite as ever, whispered, Clean hands leave the deepest stains. The back did. Luder, there was a scholar once, this is not hearsay. I saw his handwriting, and I touched the quill that had signed his banishment into pastoral praise, who refused to rename a lens a reliquary. He wrote of glass, the way lovers write of breath. He described the moon as if it were a smudge he could buff off the night with the right curve of sand. He was impatient with wonder only in the sense that he hated its costume. He wanted wonder to walk naked into the hall. The index gave him 3 choices: sanctify, smother, or exile into silence. They chose the 4th, which was a braid of all 3. They praised him from the pulpit, called him a hymn to curiosity, printed his name in a calendar that placed him on a feast day nobody would attend, and then folded his work into a drawer labeled interim. Interim is a gentle word for drowning in a basin the size of a palm. His instrument, oh, I have to speak of it, because love insists I held it only once. Custos allowed me the indulgence because he trusted me to interpret it as a cautionary tale. It was no more divine than a spoon. Its divinity lay in work, glass, brass, breath, patience. Turned toward the dome, it brought the flake of soot on the vault into a geography. I saw ranges and deltas. I saw the trace of an old ladder's foot. I saw the signature a mason leaves when he thinks no one will ever get this close again. When I lowered it, tears had made my pupils braver than lamplight required. Miracle? Custos asked, gently malicious. Labor, I said. He nodded, neither pleased nor surprised. Labor that makes miracles unbeautiful to those who trade in the theatrical, he said. Then he returned the instrument to a drawer behind a veil, and drew the veil not as a man hides a sin, but as a man spares a sleeping infant a draught. We moved to a shelf of herbals bound in green that had dulled to the color of remorse. Here the laundering was subtler. A plant that eased childbirth had been renamed Our Lady's Patience. Another that stopped bleeding had been christened St. Longinus's Rest, as if a centurion's myth conferred more authority than a midwife's accumulated competence. Marginal hands had added recipes for inks and for syrups with the same calm. I copied a notation that read, For fever, willow. Then, in smaller hand, for fear, a candle in company. The latter was not medicine, but I refused to call it useless. Still, the habit of mixing comfort with cure trains a population to demand blessing with every bandage. It is a habit easy to govern. At the southern end of the hall, a case of maps refused to hold still. Custos called this normal. History has not finished choosing its borders, he said, as if history were a river playing at shyness. When I removed a chart dated to an age that still considered dragons a kind of weather, the ink shimmered and the coast retreated a thumb's width. "You see?" he asked. "Obedience." "To whom?" I asked, though a part of me hoped he wouldn't answer. "To the most persuasive editor," he said, and I wanted to sit down and let my respect for him become hatred, because that would have been simpler than standing where the map admitted it loved whoever held the scissors. We break our own hearts with how badly we want to keep believing the harm was unintended. I clung to that desire as a man keeps a small coin in his pocket to touch when he must pretend to smile. The keepers were not butchers. The hall did not reek of smoke. It smelled of oil and beeswax and paper that had learned to be gentle with its own fragility. The harm here had the manner of nurses. It sang lullabies. It made tea. It recorded the hour of death in a good hand. In the alcove beyond the herbals, a schoolboy's desk had been shoved against the wall. Deep grooves scarred the wood where a restless pupil had carved parallel lines with a stolen awl. Beside those lines, a single sentence in the hesitant hand of the Angelic Novice, cut so shallow the lamp had to lean in to read it. "If memory is a kingdom, borders are drawn with fear." I laid my palm over the words, not to bless them, not to erase them, but to measure the size of the country I had just crossed without a passport. My hand fit, that is how empires work. They are built to be held. Custos tapped the face of a small travel clock that had belonged to an archivist 3 superiors before him. "We are done," he said. "Leave the room, as if someone kinder will need it." I closed the folios. I coaxed the chains into the postures that told them they were understood. I cooled the lamp with the back of my finger so the wick would not sulk. At the threshold Custos turned, and to this day I cannot tell you whether it was pity or discipline in his voice added, "We ask questions by where we place a lock." He closed the grating, and the star-bowed key performed mercy on the throat of the lock again. Outside, the corridor resumed its acquiescent width, as if the hall had only been a mood. We walked among the statues who looked at the wall. Custos did not lecture. He preferred the way silence arranges its own furniture. But I had learned, in the past month, to hear his omissions, the way a nurse learns to hear a patient's absence of complaint. He had not praised me for accuracy. He had not rebuked me for curiosity. He had left the door to interpretation open just wide enough for my shadow to consider crawling through. That night, alone, I copied a page of the diary by memory. Not word for word, I was not yet that blessed by recall, but in the rhythm of its contempt for tidiness. Chain the question, not the book. A question in chains becomes an altar. Teach doubt to prefer manners to facts. Sanctify or smother. The phrases arranged themselves on my skin again, a secret rosary that did not welcome touch. I slept poorly. In my sleep, the chains did not restrain, they embraced. I woke with the taste of beeswax and apology on my tongue. In the morning, a committee I did not see revised a miracle. You think I am being poetic. I am not. I felt the revision the way a weatherache feels the rain an hour early. A small calendar on the refectory wall printed for the convenience of men who liked their holiness punctual, displayed a feast day crowned by a tiny chalice. At breakfast, the chalice had moved 1 square to the right. No one touched the page. I watched it shift. The men eating porridge did not look up. Later, when I went below, the winter ring on the astral clock had a new scratch the size of a confession. Custos ran a thumb across it and did not meet my eyes. "The sky is generous," he had said. I remembered. In the afternoon, a boy younger than me, one of the watchful hours, who still believed silence was a sacrament and not a strategy, asked to see the herbals. I stood near, not as a guard, but as a creature who could not bear to be alone with his new literacy. The boy traced the recipe for a fever draught and whispered, "My sister." I wanted to tell him to take the page and the plant and leave the building and never come back. I wanted to tell him to call the plant by its older name and let it work without being blessed into humility. I said none of this. I pointed to willow, and then to water, and then to rest. He nodded, as if I had spoken a spell. Perhaps I had. Perhaps all instruction is a grammar lesson in how to consent to someone else's naming. Before Compline, I returned to the hall to replace a bottle of oil. The grating greeted me like a polite clerk. I made myself walk the middle of the corridor without touching the oak. I think I was trying to prove to the room that I could be trusted not to love it too loudly. At the far end, beneath a small window no larger than a book, I found a scrap of paper folded into the shape of a wing. Children do this with their boredom. The fold was crisp. The paper was pilfered from a ledger. Faint columns showed through the crease like ribs. On the wing's underside, a sentence in the novice's hand. "We will not burn the books. We will teach them to behave." I looked up at the chain above and saw where a link polished smoother than its neighbors confessed a century of similar pauses, similar readings, similar tiny crimes of recognition. I slid the wing back into the ledger from which it had been stolen and left the ledger ajar by the width of a late courage. If I seem to be circling, it is because the hall teaches circles. It is the geometry of the leash. But each circuit moved me a degree nearer to the center, where something unlabeled waited with its hands folded. I would later call it an argument. I would later call it the editorial knife. In these pages, at this hour, I can only call it the slow education of my doubt, doubt that had been taught manners by a curriculum titled On the Proper Education of Doubt, doubt that had learned to bow, doubt that had not yet learned how to refuse tea offered by a hospitable jailer. When I lay down, the chains continued at the edge of my hearing, a rehearsal for a lullaby that did not mean me well. I did not sleep at once. I repeated the 3 sentences Custos had offered me and the one the diary had pinned into my shoulder. I thought of the lens that had bruised starlight, and of the pump that had been renamed a relic, and of the map that retreated like a shy animal when I exhaled. I wondered how many nurses it takes to keep a patient from suspecting he is a prisoner. I wondered if I was the patient. I wondered if I had volunteered. Accuracy precedes understanding. Understanding precedes courage. Courage must learn to arrive late. Clean hands leave the deepest stains. In the morning, the stains did not show. Lemon dries clear. That is one of the hall's favorite jokes. But when I lit the lamp again, the words returned in the orange circumference the same way a truth returns when you shine attention on it with the right angle and the right patience and the right rhythm of breath. The lamp breathed. The chains settled. The pages exhaled. And somewhere, hours away on a calendar only the clock understood, A winter that did not occur began to gather its own weather. The astral clock does not tick the way a mortal clock ticks. It exhales. Brass takes on the temperature of ritual. Circles memorize the hands that turn them. If you stand beneath the dome long enough, the mechanism begins to treat your pulse as a suggestion. My first week with the clock, I mistook its patience for indifference. By the third, I understood. It was a shepherd considering whether I belonged to the flock. Custos had warned me that time, below ground, does not behave like sky. The heavens are generous, he'd said, and he meant it. But generosity can be dangerous in the hands of men who covet permission. The dome's oculus admitted a stingy coin of daylight, and even that was filtered by dust that had learned reverence. Around us, white chalk marks annotated the stone in a tidy language of maintenance. Degrees, dates, initials of superiors long dead who still preferred their initials to their names. On the central plinth, the clock rested like a patient animal disguised as a reliquary, ring within ring, each engraved with seasons in several alphabets, some of which introduced themselves as Latin when strangers visited and resumed their older faces when only the faithful remained. Never trust what the brass says at a distance, Custos told me, guiding my hand to trace the grooves with my fingers. Rings confess texture to the skin, not to the eyes. The winter ring confessed the roughness of a century of cautious corrections, a palimpsest of scrapes that had the politeness to avoid scarring one another. Smoothing the surface would have been a sin against plausible deniability. You do not erase tool marks in a hall that loves mercy. You teach them to look inevitable. There was a ritual for waking the clock. It used no incense. Incense offends brass, but required a silence trimmed to the width of 3 breaths. Custos counted them without counting, and then he set his thumb against a notch cut so humbly you'd think it were an accident. We turned the rings together. Spring shuddered past spring. Saints shifted like chessmen under the pressure of a patient hand. With the correct sequence, feast days drifted the way a snowbank drifts when a plow passes at dusk, gentle, persuasive, leaving behind the impression that the world had always intended to look like this. I asked, because 19 still lingered in my bones. Does the sky object? He did not smile. The sky is a witness, he said. It tells anyone who cares to listen what it has done. We do not blame a witness for being quoted selectively. He released the notch. The rings settled. The dome accepted the new alignment without drama. A sparrow, somewhere in the courtyard above, made a sound like a question mark, and then flew on. The diary by now, a creature that followed me the way a conscience does when you pretend you don't need it, had given the clock a line that would not stop writing itself across my ribs. Time is a shepherd. Move the fence, the flock follows. The first time I read it, I thought of pilgrims and timetables. The third time, I thought of treaties and the way ink teaches maps to obey more eagerly than rivers do. The 7th time, I thought of my own life and the subtle arithmetic by which a vow can subtract a boy's name and add him back later as a function. There is a rumor you've heard, perhaps in a bar where men love history because it lets them be impolite with better vocabulary. They call it a phantom century, a stretch of time that did not occur and yet sits on calendars like an upholstered chair no one remembers ordering. I will not argue for or against that rumor. I will only tell you what the diary instructed me to look for once the clock permitted me to see. If you suspect a gap, count the shadows that bridge it. Shadows are more faithful than monuments. Monuments are always in conversation with the knife. The first shadow was a winter that did not occur. Not a meteorological oddity, no. A winter of ritual. The calendar showed a fasting season that, when mapped against the rings and the correspondences, failed to cast the correct penumbra on the feasts that followed. The hymns written for it borrowed melodies from a decade that hadn't learned to sing yet. The vestments dyed for its processions used a formula discovered later in a city that hadn't named itself yet. These are not the errors of sloppiness. These are the parfums of a room staged for a visitor and then left intact long after the visit, in case someone wealthy dropped by unannounced. But visitors notice, I said, to no one. The brass offered its old answer, only the kind who are not invited. Custos taught me the etiquette of correction. It was not to be done with zeal. Zeal scars brass. It was to be done with devotion's older cousin, which is steadiness. We attended to a misbehaving equinox whose refusal to arrive on cue had annoyed a bishop who liked his homilies punctual. We let the spring ring lean a whisper to the left. We compensated with a nudge in the harvest circle that would ensure traders kept their coins and consciences in the same pocket. People believe in God, Custos said, with greater vigor when trains are on time. He did not mean trains, not exactly, but we both looked up as if to check whether the oculus had grown an iron track along its rim. I learned the clock's moods. It resented cold fingers. It forgave small arithmetic performed with humility. It despised being asked to lie. There are ways to lie with rings. Every tool can be taught to betray itself. But it punished us when we tried. You say I romanticize metal. I say you have never apologized to an instrument and felt the apology accepted. We apologized often. A scratch too deep, a turn too eager, an annotation too proud. Brass is patient with fools. In the same way the sea is patient. It will cradle your failure until you mistake buoyancy for consent, and then it will let go. In a ledger kept in a hand, more chairman than monk, I traced the minutes of a council convened to discuss what was politely called harmonization. The word appeared 6 times on one page, each time with a longer tail on the final N, as if the pen itself had grown bored with its falseness and tried to walk away. Julian had become Gregorian, with much dust and splendor once, and that story is told strenuously in halls that need their change to dress as inevitability. The ledger's concern was of a quieter breed, a rotation of feasts and fasts calculated to align trade fairs, tax collections, military musters, and the domestic impulse to repent with a rhythm that made a culture predictable enough to govern without the mess of blood. Blood is extravagant, a margin noted, in that old angelic hand. Calendars are economical. I copied the sentence onto my skin and hated that my body was becoming an index for what the mind might forget under pressure. The phantom century call it 3 digits of convenience appeared in the papers the way a ghost appears in old paintings, as a light that falls where there is no source. Correspondences cited documents dated with numerals whose ink was made with a binder unavailable until after the scribe had died. An obituary praised a man's learning in terms borrowed from a poet unborn. Long ledgers enumerated inventories that included tannins that were not marketed yet, and fabrics that had not found the looms that would love them. These errors were too small for the proud, and too many for the innocent. "Who keeps count?" I asked the lamp. The lamp did not answer. Lamps answer only with patience or ash. I consulted the diary not openly. Consultation below ground is a species of weather, and it directed me to a page where the novice had sketched a shepherd's crook. The crook was measured in finger widths and odd half-inches. Practical, almost tender. Beside it, the line that had started to govern me. Move the fence, the flock follows. Below that, a second sentence I had not noticed before. Perhaps because grief had been busy elsewhere. Move the fence often enough, and lambs forget there was pasture beyond it. I pressed my wrist to the warm brass of the harvest ring until the ghost of a circle printed itself on my skin, the way we used to pretend we wore saints' relics secreted under our sleeves. It was not piety. It was transference. The clock was the relic now. The saint was schedule. Suppose, Custos said, in the voice he used for surgical hypotheticals, suppose there were a year we could not use. Suppose pestilence took its appetite for continuity away. Suppose war ate the months like bread and left fingerprints where we prefer clean ink. What would you do with such a year? His eyes did not leave the rings. He turned Winter backward a notch and forward again, like a man teaching a dog to pretend to fetch. What would you do with a year that did not cooperate with storytelling? I wanted to answer, suffer it, tell the truth, let the wound look like a wound. Instead, I said nothing, because I was learning silence again, this time in dialect. You fold it into the hinge, he said, a little sadly. You let a door swing where nothing stands. Folding a year into a hinge requires a choreography of decencies. You ask maps to attend to different borders. You request that a feast long associated with a particular harvest consent to a new companionable fruit. You praise a saint on a day when he would once have been traveling and teach him how to sit instead. The faithful adjust. The markets applaud. Ships leave port to hymns pitched in keys that flatter their sails. No one thinks to ask where the wind learned the melody. I am making this sound too gentle. It was not gentle. It was only quiet. Quiet is a tool. We used it lavishly. We told people they were remembering when we were asking them to practice forgetting. We changed the edges of weeks so imperceptibly that grandmother's blessed bread one day sooner, and then one day later, and after a decade, would have sworn it had always been thus. The clock does not force the flock. It coaxes it to think the new gate opens on the same meadow. I found, in a drawer that trusted my hands more than it should have, a folio of copied letters between a cardinal with a mind like an abacus and a prince who had learned to think of hunger as a political instrument. They spoke of calendar reform as if discussing irrigation. Grain riots obeyed dates, the cardinal argued. In the way tides obey the moon, move the moon a little. The prince demurred with the shy arrogance of men who fear God only when the harvest is late. The cardinal provided diagrams, circled market days in red and liturgies in green, connected them with a lattice of lines that made the prince's city look like a harp. Play here, he wrote, and pointed to a new fast season drawn like a lace collar around the time when poor men ran out of meat. They will call it penance, the note continued, and hunger will call it a plan. I closed the folio and wanted to claw the brass off the rings until they showed me a sky that could not be bullied. The sky, alas, is generous. When I raised this with Custos carefully, because it is unbecoming to scream at a man who oils leather with such love, he nodded in a manner that was neither confession nor defense. Governance, he said, is a study of circulations, blood, grain, rumor. If you can make them rhyme, people will call it peace. And if you cannot? I asked. He gestured toward the rings. Then you pray for a hinge. There were also minutes preserved from disputes that had nothing to do with bread and everything to do with memory. A saint whose feast day, by long affection, fell in a week that had acquired other meanings. Gesture of empire here, massacre there had to be moved, so that two emotions would not have to jostle at the same table. In the minutes, a committee writes, "It is unseemly to ask tears to share a linen with wine." Unseemly. That delicate word, under it, in the diary's older hand, grief is the only honest calendar. I copied both sentences. I am not sure which one I have disobeyed more often. You will ask about the phantom century again, because it glitters, because men like to wear questions like medals. Here is what I can give you without turning the dome into a trial. In the refectory hung a small calendar for the convenience of cooks who prefer saints to spices. One morning, a chalice icon had shifted a square to the right with no human hand admitted as helper. Hours later, in the clock room, a new scratch had appeared on the winter ring, a confession thin as a hair. The choir sang the wrong verse at vespers and called it a custom, and no one was rebuked. On my way to Compline, I passed a child in the courtyard, tracing letters with her finger on the stone. She wrote a month that had not come yet, and smiled as if catching a friend sneaking up behind her. You think these are coincidences. Coincidence is the language a system uses when it is being kind to itself. I began to keep a notebook of non-events. The hollow place where something should have happened and did not. A comet a bishop had publicly promised as a sign of favor failed to arrive on the night he had assigned it. A quiet amendment moved his prediction to a date when the sky would be less likely to contradict him. A metalworker counted his days by the rhythm of jobs at the mint. The pattern hiccuped and then settled into a new confidence that suited a tax scheme better than it suited the moon. A woman in the market swore her wedding had been on a Thursday she had worn blue. The color her mother said was lucky for Thursdays. Yet the certificate retrieved by a smiling clerk told her it had been a Wednesday, and suggested perhaps the blue had been in her veil instead of her dress. Memory, the clerk offered as a consolation, plays with us. The woman left with a new Wednesday. I stood behind a pillar and learned that pity can feel like complicity if you are holding the wrong kind of pen. The clock began to answer me in small mercies and small punishments. When I moved a ring with reverence, the next page I turned in the diary lay down flat as obedience. When I moved it with the impatience of a man who wants the trick without the price, the page refused to uncurl, the margin scolded by refusing to receive ink. Superstition, you say, and you are not wrong. But superstition is only the polite half of a pact between bodies that have learned to notice one another. The clock had noticed me. The diary had noticed the noticing. Between them, I was educated into the craft of doubt. Custos found me one night aligning the minor rings for what we called market consonants. Tiny adjustments to ensure that holy days did not collide with fares more useful to a prince's ledger than to a baker's patience. He watched in silence, then spoke the only blessing I have ever felt as a threat. You are good at this, he said. I froze. Good at what? At the steady hand? At the compassion that persuades itself? It is preventing a riot by making sorrow tidier? At the manipulation of brass until an empire can sleep through its own hunger? Good, he repeated. I turned the last ring with the care of a man lowering a body into holy ground. In those days, I still argued with the air. What is the harm, I asked the dome, in moving a feast to spare a massacre a rival? The dome did not answer. The dome never answers. But a drip gathered at the oculus, fattened beyond the physics of that hour, and fell. It struck the winter ring and left a mark I could not polish out. Now the ring will remember that you asked, Cousteau said, not unkindly. He did not offer to help. He left me to rub and rub until the oil on my fingers tasted like apology. The diary offered a parable I came to hate because it refused to stop being true. A mother cuts bread unevenly so that her children can quarrel about fairness instead of hunger. It sat in the margin beside a discussion of an inserted octave, 8 days pasted into a month, like a sweetness you pretend will go unnoticed. Quarrels did ensue, tidy little ones, polite as litigations. Hunger slept on the bench outside and waited for its name. I will be accused of dramatizing a craft that, in other mouths, would be called calendar reform. Let them accuse. A craft can be a weapon when its edges are honed by the habit of flattering power. In the subterranea, we did not break spines. We did not burn ledgers. We did not even tear out pages. We turned rings, we trimmed lamps, we chose which version of a hymn would be copied into the choir's book. We told time to enter the city by a different gate, and praised the city for its hospitality. The phantom century? It is not a single block of counterfeit marble parked in the middle of history like a vulgar fountain in a tyrant's courtyard. It is a lattice. It is a lace of deferrals and transpositions, and the attrition of grief that cannot keep a date, because the date has been politely moved to make room for someone's parade. Ask me for proof, and I will give you brass and breath. Ask me for dates, and I will give you scratches that did not exist yesterday. Ask me for a photograph, and I will show you a child smiling on a Thursday that her certificate insists was a Wednesday, and I will ask you which is kinder to the world, her memory or the clock. At last, impatient with my education's pace, I asked Cousteau's for the origin story he never told. Who began this? He tilted his head as if listening for a second bell behind the first. Begin is a word for children, he said. We maintain. Who taught you to maintain? A man who had watched a city burn because a fast day met a market day at a narrow bridge. He let the sentence rest where it landed. He believed coordination could save lives. I wanted to accept that, to make a shrine of it, to worship at the altar of intentions. And did it? I asked. Cousteau took a long time with his thumb on the winter ring. Sometimes, he said, and then the city owed us. And then the princes owed us. And then the habit of owing us taught us to prefer being owed to telling the truth. It is a common disease. It advances without fever. The dome has a seam in it where repairs have been made so delicately the eye cannot be convinced of fracture unless the lamp is held just so. On a night when the choir above chose a hymn too cheerful for the inventory of the dead, the city carried that week. I held the lamp just so and traced the seam around the oculus. I found initials there, small and ashamed, 2 letters no archivist had ever admitted to me. The diary had seen them. Begin with mercy, the novice wrote beside a diagram of the seam, and end with power. The path between is paved with calendars. I wrote the letters on my wrist in lemon. I let them fade in daylight. I watched them return at night, as if a century meant nothing to fruit. What do you wish me to say now? That we confessed? That we renounced the rings? that we unhooked feasts from harvests and let hunger squint again at the sun for its own arithmetic? I am not a saint. I am a witness. The clock kept its hours when we asked. It sulked when we grew proud. It punished ignorance with a petty refusal to align numbers that hate inelegance. We bent it less often than myth will claim, and more often than the conscience of men who sleep well will allow. We did not carve a century-whole cloth out of piety. We did something subtler. We taught memory to prefer rhyme to accuracy. We trained generations to hear a bell and believe the bell had always rung at that hour, because what kind of fool accuses a bell of lying? One evening, a storm muscled Rome into paying attention. Thunder unstitched the horizon. Rain ran down the stairs with a familiarity that belongs to old enemies. Under the dome the rings cooled, metal shrank. Joints complained. It is not wise to move brass when the weather remembers its childhood in a mountain. Still, we had work. A letter from a palace expected a correction to kiss a feast into a column of ledgers that would make a debt look like mercy. "Tomorrow," I said, out of fear. "Tonight," Custos said, out of obedience. We turned the rings together, two men pretending to be a hinge. The winter circle caught on a burr I had not seen. The notch slipped. The brass barked. For a second the entire device shuddered, like a horse threatened with a spur by a rider who has not yet earned the right to sit astride it. Then the mechanism settled, and with it something in me settled that had no business being calm. I had, for a heartbeat, felt the possibility of refusal, of the clock telling us, no. When it did not, relief married disappointment, and produced a child I have been raising ever since, named Complicity. Later that night, alone, the diary grew less polite than usual. The novice had sketched a calendar with 1 week missing, the gap disguised by decorations drawn so skillfully an inattentive eye would call them flourishes. Beneath it, we do not hide emptiness with darkness, we hide it with ornament. The page smelled, faintly, of smoke that had not come from fire. I understood. In the way a man understands too late the meaning of a gesture he saw 1,000 times, that every addition to the calendar, a saint here, a commemorative there, performs a subtraction that stays handsome, only if no one measures the ledger with a ruler that remembers what exactitude used to feel like. If memory is a kingdom, fear draws the borders. I had touched that sentence in Chapter 1 as if it were a borrowed jewel. In the clock room, it changed from jewelry into an address. Fear prefers predictability. Predictability prefers calendars that make kindness punctual and control invisible. We offered both, and then we congratulated ourselves for being necessary. In the confessional arithmetic of my later years, I subtract necessity first. It leaves room for other sums. On the night the chalice walked 1 square to the right in the cook's calendar, a choir boy practiced alone in the apse above us, working a psalm into the geography of his throat. He missed a note and corrected it. He missed the same note again and corrected it again, more confidently. Repetition made error obedient. I sat beneath the dome and felt something like love for the stubbornness of boys and something like grief for the stubbornness of rings. I imagined the phantom century as a rehearsal stretched too long, a choir repeating a measure until the measure forgot it was a preface and began to claim itself as a song. I imagined a mother cutting bread unequally and smiling at the quarrel because it sounded like life. I imagined a shepherd moving a fence and telling the lambs a story about wolves to explain the new horizon. If you expect now the tidy ladder down from metaphor into ledger, Accept disappointment. Tidy ladders are the souvenirs administrations sell to the faithful when we ask to be excused from vertigo. The truth was vertigo. In the subterranea, I learned to take loveless comfort in steadiness, to turn rings with a tenderness stolen from the cradle and applied to a machine that rewarded me with the lie of mercy. We were merciful. We were also editors' investments. We punished reality into legibility. You want the climax of this chapter, a clean declaration. Take this instead. The clock did not lie. We lied with it. The sky did not consent. We used consent's costume on its behalf. The phantom century is an adjective attached to a noun that will not forgive us for making it carry so much story. We did not erase an age. We taught generations to carry a calendar through the city like a lantern and to trust its light more than the moon. And when the lantern trembled, we told them it was moonlight anyway. Years later, when I left the watchful hours and tried to live where days announce themselves by weather instead of by decree, I would wake sometimes to the sensation that a ring needed turning. I would lie still and let the phantom century walk past my bed like a nurse on rounds. Sometimes I could hear her shoes. Sometimes she paused at my door and adjusted the curtain to let in or keep out a sliver of dawn. I never saw her face. I knew her by the smell of beeswax and apology. For now, here in Chapter 3, I will give you the only instruction I can bless without the taste of brass in my mouth. When a bell tells you the hour, ask yourself, very quietly, whose hand taught it that habit. If the question makes you drowsy, sleep. If it makes you angry, walk gently anyway. Anger is loud. It wakes guards. Whisper to each other instead. Compare rings with moonlight. Keep a notebook of non-events. Teach your children that Wednesday and blue do not owe a clerk their loyalty. And when the fence moves, because it will teach the lambs, the old pastures smell, just enough that they remember the word beyond. Accuracy precedes understanding. Understanding precedes courage. Courage must learn to arrive late. In matters of time, it arrives precisely when the shepherd grows tired of fences and begins to wonder who first said the flock needed one. The corridor of statues is narrow by design. Stone shoulders lean in just enough that you must pass sideways, as if memory itself were insisting on a smaller silhouette. Their faces are turned to the wall, not toward it, but into it the way flowers turn towards sun they have learned to love. There is no sun here. There is only a limewash that drinks breath, and once a year exhales. We called it the Whispering Wall, because to give it a more literal name would have been an act of vandalism. There is a calendar day, no longer on calendars, that stirs the stone. On that day, vapor blooms from marble mouths, as if the statues were trying not to speak and failing graciously. The damp hangs like a blessing with poor manners. Dust clumps. The air smells faintly of myrrh and damp linen. If you lean too close, your ears fill with a breath that learned to mimic language. The first time Custos allowed me to stand vigil there, he gave instructions as if I were being trusted with an altar and a wound. Hands behind your back. Eyes ahead. Do not ask a question. Allow the question to be discovered in you. He placed me at the seventh figure, no plaque, no inscription, only a drapery's fold and the suggestion of a hand that had once held something sharp. The wall's limewash looked ordinary until the breathing started. Then it looked like paper that had run out of refusal. The Whispering Wall is the place where our confessor claims he first understood the difference between history and memory. History, he says, is what we bind in leather and catalog under call numbers. Memory is what fogs the stone when the calendar looks away. When the vapor came, it came without drama, a chill, a moistness, the same way night comes to a city that has already surrendered the day. I heard a syllable before I knew which alphabet had chosen it. The statues do not speak in full words. To hear a word is to impose grammar. The wall prefers phonemes, tastes, hums. The syllable lifted and failed and returned, like a child learning how to shape the air into a first truth. I held still. I let it choose me. At the far end of the corridor, a second novice made the error of piety. He whispered a saint's name as a prompt. The sound struck the limewash and fell to the floor like a cup dropped from a tired hand. Custos's shadow took one step into the boy and pushed the name back into his mouth with a silence that could have been a mercy or a reprimand. "You do not feed a witness," he said, barely audible. "You do not show it pictures and ask it to nod." The boy bowed his head and learned, perhaps, that obedience is often an agreement about what will not be remembered. The smell, changed myrrh, yes, but also something cooler. The metallic mildness of water that has lived too long in stone. I do not know if the vapor lies. I know it edits. I know it chooses. And I know, on that hour, it chose me to hear the consonant that begins my name and the vowel that ends it, and a third sound that does not belong to me at all, a borrowed syllable that felt like a future I had not consented to. I stood still and let my name reassemble in the damp, letter by letter, and when it finished, what hovered on the wall was almost me. Then less than me, then someone else entirely as small, obedient sound that could be filed politely. I had been taught to erase my name. Here the wall demonstrated how. You do not scratch it out. You whisper it until it is too well-mannered to resist being moved. Then you move it to where it does not make trouble. The inventory of the erased is not empty. It is meticulously maintained. In a cabinet near the Whispering Wall, a drawer labeled Errata of Sanctity holds thin cards for those whose names once collected candles and now exist as paperwork. Saints demoted to the margins. Devotions reassigned to less crowded months. Faces carved smooth at the command of a committee embarrassed by its own passion. The cards were written in a librarian's dutiful hand. Each carried 3 lines. Name struck through, former patronage, now improper, new liturgical status, harmless. The pen nib had been kind. Kindness can be a solvent. One card stays with me. It belonged to a midwife, whose shrine gathered ribbons from women grateful to still be breathing. She had been, by rumor and practice, the one to whom certain prayers went when blood would not stop being an argument. The card listed an irregularity, a miracle unratified by committee, and a contagion of folk custom that made bishops nervous because it made women less so. Her name had been transferred to a rural calendar. Her ribbon box had been cleared into a vault. Her shrine stone had been scrubbed until it forgot being kissed. "A saint," said the card's final line, more useful as silence. The custodian had added a small dot of wax, as if to seal the decision against air. The dot looked like a tear that had learned posture. According to Aurelian, sainthood under the watchful hours was a fluid state. Patronages are reassigned. Feast days migrate. The archive prefers saints who do not argue with policy. I learned the theology of forgetting by degrees. A canonical list changes less often than a rumor, but more often than the poor would prefer. There is a discipline for subtraction. You do not announce it. You let the ink choose a paler cousin. "We do not erase," said Emmanuel in the gentlest possible voice. "We recalibrate your affection. To a mind that loves tidy light, this sounds wise. To a woman who kept a ribbon for a midwife and found the ribbon labeled improper devotion, it sounds like cruelty rehearsed as pastoral care. Far from the wall, in a room that feigns daylight with linen and candles, there is a different practice, the art of imitation. I struggle to write about it, because the brass of the clock still lives in my mouth when I speak the word. There exists a protocol older than scandal, younger than necessity for substituting a body when a ceremony requires a presence and politics refuses to deliver one. You call it mask if you are unkind. You call it custodia personae if you were ever allowed to read the minutes. Do not imagine carnival. Imagine discipline. Height within half an inch. The patience to breathe at the rate the original breathes when anxious, when certain, when bored by a litany. The voice is not counterfeited. It is tuned throat, taught to sit inside vowels the way a hand sits inside a glove. The gestures are not acted. They are borrowed and practiced until the body forgets itself and remembers only choreography. The point is not deception for theft. The point is continuity for the sake of a world that panics when continuity takes a day off. I saw such a substitution once. I do not offer you a face. I offer you a glove. 6 of them, white, folded into each other like a parable about infinite cleanliness. The man who held them had hands that did not know soil. He stood behind a lattice and learned to disappear into an outline that had influence. When his outline was complete, a bell rang. Not the bell I hate. A smaller bell, without theology. 2 men adjusted the light to flatter a chin. Another man applied a dab of scent to a cuff link so that anyone whose memory resided in their nose would nod at the correct ghost. The ceremony proceeded elegantly. Elegance is the anesthetic of moral injury. How is this not fraud? It depends on your definition of who. If an office is a mask, and they are, all of them, from usher to pontiff, then you can persuade yourself that the wearer is merely a function, and that a function can be fulfilled by an accurate imitation. There is a book that teaches this accuracy. Thin, bound in a skin that pretends not to resent touch. Its title, On the Management of Gaps. The first page is a catechism of continuity. What is interrupted? A confidence. What must not be allowed to happen to confidence? Panic. How is panic prevented? By the likeness of the expected. The expected is a tyrant. We dressed him carefully. The whispering wall did not approve. That year, the vapor gathered and did not condense. The air held a throb of syllables that fell before they found consonants. The statues' mouths looked, for a second, like an accusation cast in chalk. Then the damp receded all at once, as if disgust had learned how to be a breeze. I know what you want. Names. The archive forbids them, and the ethics of witness agrees. You cannot redeem a lie by fastening a face to it in retrospect. The practice persists because it works. As most sins do, a city continues to believe itself governed. The poor continue to find bread on the right days. The pageantry continues to perform order. And in a small drawer behind cloth, a man whose face resembles power removes a glove and looks at the red marks, a cuff left on his wrist, like a faint administrative stigmata. He breathes the borrowed scent and looks surprised to find it sad. Aurelian says he read the notebooks of those who taught imitation. The lessons are precise. 3 ways to carry a ring, 7 preferred postures for the left hand, 2 kinds of smiles, 1 for blessing, 1 for absolving accounts. It is choreography as a theory of truth. Memory requires a stage to believe itself. If you keep the stage intact and the cues punctual, the cast can survive substitutions. The archive is full of stage directions, annotated by men who wept while writing them, and then numbered their pages so carefully it hurt to watch. There were notes on humidity for voices, not for parchment, on diet for reflection in the eyes, on sleep for the way fatigue ruins cadence. The most important note was shortest. Do not improvise. Improvisation is where a person peeks out from beneath the role. We avoided people whenever possible. Beside this discipline stood its shadow, erasure. When an improviser forced a role to become a person, we learned how to fold that person out of the room. I studied the manuals that teach erasure as if they were surgery texts. Remove in this order: feast, patronage, statue, plaque, song. Leave a proverb if necessary. Wait 2 generations. Then tidy the proverb. The cruelty is not in the removal. It is in the proverb. A proverb erases the need for a story while pretending to protect it. In a small vault labeled Devotions Improper, I found the glass coffin of a name no one had the nerve to pronounce incorrectly anymore. A scholar's hand had written in the confident script of failed tenderness, transferred to the silence appropriate for dangerous affection. The coffin held no relics, only ribbons and paper-thin medals with faces worn smooth by thumb and lip. I stood there and understood what we thought we were protecting. Not God, not truth, only the peace of administrators. On a separate shelf, Martyrology Errata. Could a book be more honest and more obscene? It listed martyrs with asterisks, the administrative star that turns blood into index entries. Beside certain names, the star multiplied. Asterisk, asterisk, we are sorry. Their story resisted corroboration. Their death was late to be useful. Their miracle offended a schedule. Their courage suggested the wrong lesson. The pages smelled like a classroom where chalk writes explanations no one will test. The whispering wall taught me a different curriculum. It insisted on syllables. You cannot forge syllables. They betray the mouth's history. One year, the vapor sketched an S that the committee had been erasing from a saint's name in printed calendars because a courtly language found it rustic. The S curled on the wall with peasant stubbornness. The limewash held it. The memory of a village held it. A woman standing at the far end pressed a ribbon to her own throat as if to help the consonant breathe. The committee relented 2 winters later, not because of an S, but because a statistic. But I allowed myself the heresy of believing that stone can lobby when grammar cannot. I learned that memory, like time, has tools. We owned them. We oiled them. We called them mercy. On the desk near the wall lay a small vellum booklet titled Reconciliations. It contained formulas for soothing the unrest that follows subtraction, prayers to redirect affection, hymns that borrow old melodies so the mouth obeys while the mind resists, homilies that explain why forgetting is a form of obedience, why obedience is a form of love, why love is measured best in quiet. In the margin of the first page, in the Angelic Novice's hand, we do not reconcile, we retrain. I traced the word retrain on my skin with lemon and felt ashamed and relieved in the same breath. Like a child who learns his favorite lullaby is propaganda and still needs to sleep. The practice of imitation demanded a shadow practice. Disposal. What do you do with the names removed from plaques, the faces chiseled smooth? The subterranea answered gently. You make an ossuary for syllables. We called it the cupboard of unpronounced things. Inside, shelves of small vellum slips held letters, single letters, sometimes doubled a leftover th from a river, renamed to flatter a patron, an e diacritic borrowed from a kingdom wanting to seem older. We did not burn letters. We stored them like seed, in case. A senior keeper wrote in a century I had learned to smell by its tallow. We need to grow the old name again. The arrogance, the tenderness. We were gardeners of forgetting. The record suggests the watchful hours believed or taught themselves to believe that preservation of possibility absolved them of subtraction. We kept the letters, they could say. We can spell her again if needed. Aurelian calls this theology of escrow. In the teaching room where young keepers practice their hand, we copied the protocol of disappearance. It reads like a lullaby. Soothe first, suggest later, remove quietly, replace with an object of similar weight. If you remove a saint, add a proverb. If you remove a face, add a legend about humility. If you remove a calendar day, add a harvest tip. The trick is equivalence without resemblance. People accept substitutions if they share mass. Difficulty begins when they share outline. At Compline one night, a hymn broke in the middle and reassembled in a different key because a cantor, raised on the erased version of a saint, sang by reflex the older refrain. The choir hesitated, then followed him into the original shape. Afterward, a director with eyes that loved symmetry more than mercy thanked the choir for their flexibility and assigned them the new refrain again, louder. The director's palm smelled of the same myrrh I now associate with the wall. Smell is a calendar the archive cannot edit. We had a drawer for maps of names, not places. Names. The cartography of syllables shifts when power moves its chair. In those maps, vowels stretch like borders, consonants fortify or fall like walls. The Jesuit appears in one corner of the map, patient with crystal. The Rosicrucian appears in the other, delighted by cloud. The novice's footnote underneath: crystal without cloud is a prison. Cloud without crystal is a fog. The people need rain, not glass. In a rare outbreak of cheer, I laughed at the boldness in the margin, and then covered the laugh with the cough the corridor accepts as penance. The Committee for Harmonious Remembrance met without us, of course. We saw the minutes. They were a ballet of euphemisms that had trained with soldiering: unification, clarification, consolidation. A saint's face disappears from a niche because a niche is needed for a banner that prevents a protest. The minutes congratulate themselves. They document peace acquired through aesthetic correction. In a later hand, cramped and unwilling. Aesthetic correction is a clean name for a bruise. I am not proud of this, but I participated. In a small chapel where sailors leave vows like cords, I scraped at a paint flake shaped like a face the committee had asked to forget. The face did not scream. It came away politely, guard by guard, as if cooperating. Accuracy, I told myself, the old sentence marching out like soldiers from a barracks. Understanding, I rehearsed, because it makes an obedient accomplice feel like a philosopher. Courage, I paused there, must learn to arrive late. I was not sure anymore whether I was teaching courage how to be punctual or how to go missing. The paint dust settled on my cuffs. It looked like ash and behaved like guilt. On the wall weeks later, the vapor came early, out of season, as if annoyance had its own liturgy. It traced a letter I did not recognize, neither Latin nor Greek, nor any flourish a bishop could bless. A letter like a fishbone and a flame. Custos stood in the shadow and watched it write. There are alphabets older than the empire of policy, he said. It comforted me. It chastened me. The letter hung and faded the way courage does in a long meeting. In the archive of disguises, we didn't call it that. We called it wardrobe. I learned undeniably that roles eat people. Robes wear men who dared believe they were wearing robes. Rings curve fingers. Shoes teach gates. A mask, handled with reverence and washed with alcohol like a relic, teaches a jaw to belong to someone who does not need to apologize. I do not hate the practice. I hate its ease. Ease is the enemy of repentance. The Angelic Novice's diary did not spare itself when that chapter came. There is a drawing, a mask laid beside a loaf of bread. The caption, "One feeds the people." A second drawing, a mask laid beside a mirror. The caption, "One feeds the mask." I copied the pair onto a lemon-stung slice of skin near my wrist. Sometimes, in candlelight, the mask reflected back at me where my hand should have been. I understood the warning. The instrument turns the holder into an instrument. Control is a diet that ends in famine. I found in a poor box, those narrow boxes that collect small honesty from people who cannot afford tidy sin. A folded note, addressed to a saint, I had helped to relocate to a safer century. The writer asked for work, and for her mother to sleep without pain. She spelled the saint with the stubborn S. She dated the note in a month we had trimmed. She pressed the paper flat with both hands. I could see the heel marks of her palms. I wanted to replace the saint, the way a mother wants to replace a lost sock on a frozen morning. I wanted to move the fence back in the night and tell the lambs they had always had this pasture. I wanted to write penance on my forehead in ink the wall could sniff at and laugh. Instead, I left the note and pretended that the saint would learn how to forward mail. We want to believe memory is a rescue. But Aurelian insists it is also a weapon, and that the archive learn to swing it with the grace of a surgeon. Grace is an aesthetic word for accuracy that has lost its shyness. In the room where the martyrology errata lives, I learned to cut a name without the body noticing. This is how. You search the hymns first. Where a name repeats, you replace it with a title. Where a title gathers too much affection, you replace it with an attribute. Attributes can be aggregated without grief. Then you address the iconographers. You do not ask them to erase. You ask them to repaint shadow so that cheekbones forget the portrait they once remembered. Then you give the catechists a more flattering story. Then you wait. Stories do the rest. The whispering wall does not forget. Memory that has been asked too often to be polite curdles into geologic stubbornness. On an evening when the guard rotation forgot to vary, carelessness detectable as a seam in a forged document, the wall drew a vapor line that connected 3 letters from 3 different saints into a name that belonged to none of them and all of them. A composite, an accusation. We know what you have done, the line said in a grammar I cannot translate. I put my hand on the limewash, the way a doctor lays a hand on a fevered brow, and whispered nothing at all, because I had finally learned not to feed witnesses. There is a proverb, old as the practice of hiding knives in liturgy. In the city of masks, truth is a mouth without a face. The keepers loved it. It let them pretend that they were defending truth from theatrics. The diary cut the proverb in half and pinned the halves to opposite pages. On the left, in the city of masks, truth is a mouth. On the right, without a face. Between them, a drawing of a wall that exhales. The instruction below, stand where the halves cannot be mistaken for a whole. I stood there as often as they would let me, and on the day they stopped letting me, I knew Chapter V had begun to reach for my throat. Before that, one more instruction, learned the hard way. When you must subtract, subtract yourself. If you cannot save a name, let your name go thin and walk quietly. I practiced erasing my name until the corridor smiled at my humility, and once almost forgot I was there. In that almost, I felt a peace so indecent I wanted to confess it to a stranger. The peace of not being asked to remember. I resisted it the way a surgeon resists fainting. The room started to like me less after that. Good. Rooms that love you become jealous of your refusal. When the summons came to witness a rite that would correct a line of history that had learned to bend like a willow, I had already learned to hate my competence. Competence persuades a conscience to put on gloves. It is a correction, the senior keeper said, voice wrapped in decent linen. It is not violence. I understood, and I knew the sentence the diary had prepared for me. Clean hands leave the deepest stains. I washed my hands anyway, with soap that smelled like lemon, and watched words rise on my skin as if I were a parchment warming to speech. I covered them with sleeves and followed the key that opened the door to a room where scissors are polished the way relics are, and where a quill that had signed coronations was prepared to sign something smaller and more permanent, a forgetting that would look, to the city above, like the tidying of a footnote. On my way, I stopped at the whispering wall. No vapor, no consonants, only limewash, and the faint outline of fingers where other confessors had rested their hands when courage arrived late and found no seat. I did the impolite thing. I asked a question out loud. What is your name? I did not mean the wall. I meant the person welded to its silence. The air did not answer. It carried my breath a few inches, and then folded it away with the expertise of a wardrobe master. Memory is a kingdom. Fear draws borders. We patrolled them like dutiful soldiers who admired the map more than the field. The field was stone that breathed. The map was a manual that taught us to call that breath a draft. I walked on. The right waited. The scissors gleamed. The page to be corrected lay open as if volunteering. I took my place at a desk where erasures are made to look like grammar. The bell that is not a bell rang once. In the next chapter you will ask me what they cut and how, and whether the wound healed straight. You will ask me whether the man with the gloves wore the face he had borrowed or the face he could live with later. You will ask me whether the wall ever exhaled my name again. Not yet. Here, at the end of memory's corridor, let me leave you with the smallest antechamber and the smallest tool. A pencil sharp enough to remove letters without removing paper. We called it a kindness. Kindness, in that room, is a mask we wore for ourselves so that the silence would agree to be called sacred again. The room where correction happens is smaller than rumor deserves. Power likes its chambers intimate. It prefers to hear itself breathe. 3 tables form a horseshoe around a lectern that looks too humble until you see the polished groove where the wrists of generations have learned the same apology. On the wall, a shelf with 3 objects as if labeled by a quiet catechism. A black candle, a quill that has signed coronations, a pair of scissors whose blades know rope and silk, and the soft insistence of paper. Custos stood at the hinge of the horseshoe like a hinge himself. He was not the presider, there are ranks eager for the comfort of that name, but he was the hand the room trusted when intent began to fray. The presider wore linen so white it read as noise. 2 assistants arranged light so that paper looked obedient. My place was at the right table, where accuracy makes a bed for understanding, and understanding tries not to wake courage. The book waiting on the lectern was not a book of doctrine. The worst wounds are seldom theatrical. It was a ledger. Names, transactions, deliveries, cross-referenced with dates that had lately learned to slide like furniture on a polished floor. Tucked into its belly lay a witness. A letter written by a woman in a market district whose memory refused to submit to our new arithmetic. Her husband's death had returned on the wrong anniversary. Her grief had grown fangs. She had written to us with a tired ferocity only the poor can afford. "You have stolen a day," she wrote. "Give it back." The presider read the letter aloud in a voice that was careful not to mock. Then he folded it with a kindness the room mistook for consent. "We are not thieves," he said. "We are guardians of coherence." His fingers brushed the black candle with the same absent affection a bishop shows a reliquary in a corridor full of cameras. "Coherence," he repeated, as if the syllables were a warm cloth for a fever we preferred to call a mood. "The right of binding, as described in several restricted manuals and confirmed by our confessor, consists of 3 gestures performed upon a page: inscription, excision, and sealing. Its theology is not violent. That is why it works. Inscription first. The quill, more artifact than instrument, was set in my hand the way knives are placed upon tables on truce nights, gently blade away. The word I was tasked to write was small and indecently confident. As it was, not as it is, not as it must be for now, as it was. We apply the past tense like a bandage. If you persuade a wound to accept yesterday, it stops bleeding on your boots. I dipped the quill. The ink smelled of iron and labor. The page waited the way shame waits when it knows you have arrived wearing gloves. The formula for the entry had been composed by a committee that loved modesty and could not help performing it. Delivery of 20 sacks of wheat to the lower quarter, affirmed on the 5th day of the corrected fast. The woman's letter insisted the wheat had come on the 6th day, and that the 6th day had existed, that children had eaten on it, and a man had died on it, and a bell had rung that would never ring again for the living. We were to make her 6th day obedient to our 5th. The logic was clean as a blade. As it was, I wrote in the margin, this time in Latin, the way a doctor uses the old language when he wants a fact to stop protesting. The quill's tip spread the ink across the fibers with a confidence I have only seen in men who need crowds to believe that confidence is the same as innocence. The room hummed. The candle waited. Excision second. The scissors lay in a velvet cradle that made them look quieter than a weapon. Their blades were sharpened for rope, for parchment, for the occasional ribbon when piety asked for a pleasant sound. The presider placed them in Custos's hand, then reconsidered and placed them in mine. I am not sentimental about tools, but there are objects that change temperature when they are about to be misused. The scissors were warm with other men's decisiveness. My fingers tried to learn the same heat. We were not instructed to cut the letter. That would be barbarity. The rite teaches taste. We were to make a measured excision of a footnote in the ledger that appealed to an older dating of the fast. Remove the cross-reference. Remove the ladder the woman had used to climb out of our arithmetic. The footnote was tiny, a single line that pointed to a choir book annotation where a cantor had scribbled the older refrain. A small truth, and almost, we were to trim it as a tailor trims a thread that would otherwise unravel a seam. Gently, the presider said. We are not brutes. I slid the blade under the word. The page yielded without flinching. I felt like a dentist removing a nerve with such competence the mouth reframed pain as gratitude. The paper accepted the absence and draped itself around the gap like a courtier hiding a bruise with silk. The cut was clean. I hated it for being clean. Sealing last. The black candle has a scent that only the guilty enjoy. Not myrrh. Myrrh is for witnesses. This was something sweeter, like molasses left out on a windowsill to court wasps. The assistant lit the wick from a lamp that had never seen daylight. The flame grew into its assignment without ceremony. Custos tilted the candle. Wax fell. Not a blob, not a bruise, a seam. We pressed a small stamp into the wax, the crest of harmonization, and watched order accept its own scar. There, the presider said, pleased the way a surgeon is pleased when the organ resumes its rhythm. We have corrected the record. The assistants went about their tidy chores. The lamp wick coaxed into a clean cone. The quill wiped with a cloth that had never learned stain. The scissors returned to velvet and pretended to sleep. We asked Aurelian what changed in that moment besides a footnote. He said, "The room learned my name. I had erased my name as a discipline. The subterranea had been kind enough to believe me, but the rite creates intimacy. When you cut a page, the building smells your hands." I stood there while the wax cooled and felt the room memorize my pulse. The whispering wall is not connected to the rite's chamber by anything as theatrical as a secret corridor, but stones require no hallways to conspire. Somewhere beneath the limewash, a syllable rolled over and looked at me. Protocol demanded that the woman's letter be answered. We did not say you are wrong. We said you are right, in a way that must not be binding. We included a calendar printed with a modesty elegant enough to be persuading even to hunger. We wrote a blessing that rearranged her grief into an allegory about perseverance. The presider dictated, I inscribed. Custos watched, neither defending us nor delivering us to our better selves. He had learned the discipline of being furniture when the room required a table. When we emerged from the chamber, the corridor felt thinner, as if we had moved a wall with our eyes by staring at it too obediently. A boy in the watchful hours, one whose handwriting still suffered from the vigor of being new to vows, was waiting with a tray of cups. Water, not wine. We each took one. We sipped like men who have learned certain blood types cannot afford euphoria. You will see the benefit, the presider told me. The way bankers speak about compound interest. The city will be calmer. The hymn will rhyme with the market. The moon will be spared the embarrassment of contradicting our announcements. In 23, Whatever I said something I regret only because it sounded like a clever man auditioning for a quote in someone else's book. We have not spared the moon, I said. We have spared ourselves the color of the bruise. The presider did not rebuke me. He was a professional. Boys who love the exact shade of bruises, he said, do not keep the peace. Custos's face made a polite door between us. Hurry slowly, he said, as if he had just discovered the phrase. That night, the whispering wall breathed out of season again. Not vapor, a warmth, as if vowels had blood. I stood before it, hands behind my back, the way Custos taught me to stand when the thing before me deserved dignity and could not ask for it. The limewash darkened in a shape I knew, a hinge, not a door, a hinge, the part no one praises in a painting, the part that fails first when the weather learns to resent houses. In the cupboard beside the wall, the reconciliations booklet had a new page. No hand had turned the page. No hand had written the page. I am not asking you to stint skepticism. I am asking you to accept the inventory as I found it. The new page contained a single formula for curing unrest after an editorial cut. Pair the loss with a rhyme. If you remove a day, give the city a proverb about patience. If you remove a name, provide a story about humility. If you remove a footnote, supply a sermon about the dangers of trivia. The page was signed with no hand I knew. Underneath, the Angelic Novice had added a line in smaller script, as if ashamed of its own accuracy. Rhymes are the shackles of memory. I carried that line into sleep and woke with the metal aftertaste of a rhyme built to restrain. The next morning, in the refectory, the calendar a cook used to avoid fasting on days the city needed strength had been repainted just enough. A chalice icon moved again, this time left instead of right. Men ate without noticing that their hunger had been learned by a committee. The choir attempted the corrected refrain and, with relief, found themselves singing it more easily than the old one. Ease is the most dangerous flavor. It seasons obedience until it tastes like consent. You would like proof, perhaps. You would like me to place a date, a name, a photograph in your lap. The archive has trained you to believe in such trophies. I have been trained to know they are masks that corrode slower than faces. Take instead the minute of a meeting I was not supposed to see, left open on a desk by a clerk who believed himself alone with decency. The woman's letter, the minutes read, has been answered with charity. Her parish priest has been instructed to counsel remembrance as a virtue unbound to day of month. Catechesis, to follow on the theme, grief is a week long when love is a year long. The sentence is earnest. It is also a cage. Custos found me in the doorway reading and did not scold. There is a second right, he said, looking tired in a way men look tired when a building has memorized their stride too precisely. One the manuals do not name. He led me back to the chamber. It had been set for another correction. A scholar's marginalia in a gospel, a note about a phrase that had migrated across languages, losing a tooth on the journey. The correction would not be dramatic. A single etymology rescued from the wrong ancestor and returned to a house with better furniture. Do you know the second right? He asked. I shook my head. The right of refusal, he said softly. We perform it by doing nothing. He set the scissors back in their cradle and blew out the candle. Smoke wrote a short black sentence on the air. Sometimes, he said, the bruise is the only proof a blow was real. We left the gospel uncorrected. For a week, the city did not fall apart. For a week, the moon did not protest. For a week, the presider did not summon us. I thought perhaps we had learned to love bruises. On the 8th day, a messenger arrived, velvet glove, clean boots, the scent of an office that had never had to tolerate mildew. A letter with a seal that rearranges the faces of men who think they resist being rearranged. The letter praised the watchful hours for their prudence and asked us to bind 3 more footnotes, seal 2 more seams, and remove a name from a plaque, because the face it belonged to had begun to gather candles that smelled like the wrong politics. The messenger smiled with the warmth of a coat lined with conscience. "We are grateful," he said. Gratitude weighs more than obligation. The editorial knife, in Aurelian's account, is a ritualized habit rather than an object. Its edge is grammar, its handle is procedure. It draws blood politely. I will tell you about the scholar with the lenses, because I owe him the courtesy of consequence. You remember him from the Hall of Chains, a man who wanted wonder to walk naked into the room. His notes had been filed under interim, which is the archive's lullaby for insomnia. After the rite, I went to his drawer and found his diagrams amended in a hand not his, labels softened into piety, distances softened into near enough. The instrument itself, glass, brass, breath, patience, had been assigned a patron saint and an approved prayer so that boys could play with it without learning the smell of labor. I held the metal and felt it colder than before, like a friend avoiding your eye after you lied on his behalf. I carried the instrument to the dome. I pointed it at the seam we had traced in Chapter 3, the one that tells on repairs only in a cruel light. The seam blurred. I adjusted the focus. It blurred more. I whispered an ugliness. We sealed the lens. I turned, and the clock allowed me to see that I had not been the only one performing rites in small rooms. The winter ring bore a scratch I did not recognize, thin as the line a guilty man draws on his own wrist to pretend he can count his penance. I pressed my finger to it until the groove accepted my heat. I thought of the woman in the market, counting a 6th day with her palms. After Vespers, a boy was brought to the wall for the first time. He was younger than I had been, and his name, that stubborn S again, had already been taught to behave. Custos asked him to stand still. The vapor did not come. The boy tried to supply a syllable, the way children try to complete an adult sentence to be rewarded with approval. I was quicker than my shame. "Do not feed a witness," I said, and heard myself become a piece of furniture with a voice. The presider arrived with his linen and his clean word coherence. He scanned the corridor and addressed us as if we were debtors late to gratitude. "There is unrest," he said. "Words are leaking." He meant the market woman. He meant the scholar's true labels resurfacing in the mouths of boys who had played with the instrument unsupervised. He meant the old refrain the choir kept slipping into when the melody got tired. He asked for more binding. He asked for a sealing of rumor. He used the kindness that makes a man believe he is choosing to kneel. I chose not to. Not loudly. Loud is for flags. I chose the second rite. I walked to the chamber and set the scissors aside. I wrote nothing. I blew out the candle. I left the quill sleeping. It is not heroism to do nothing. It is merely the refusal to choreograph someone else's forgetting. I expected reprimand. I received something worse, acceptance. The presider smiled the way men smile at a dog that has learned to sit. "Late courage," he said, approving my schedule. "Useful in moderation." Useful. The word cut deeper than any blade I had held. I understood then the full ambition of the editorial knife. It wants to turn even refusal into a function. It wants to number dissidence, to assign its hour, to mark its limits in a manual, to turn bruises into a rubric. If you can catalog refusal, you can schedule it. If you can schedule it, you can survive it. The archive has a drawer for everything, including me. On the night that should have been the woman's 6th anniversary, no calendar would confess it. I took her letter from the box where copies sleep and walked it down to the wall. I read it aloud in my head so the limestone would not accuse me of spectacle. I stood the way Custos taught me. I placed my palm on the limewash. It was warm with the patience of geology. If memory is a kingdom, I whispered, fear draws borders. The wall did not breathe. It held. You will ask what the right has made of me. It made me legible to a building I used to believe loved me only for my quiet. It made me useful, and then it taught me usefulness is the room nearest to obedience. It taught me the smell of wax that seals lies with a stamp pious enough to be mistaken for a wound's blessing. It taught me the weight of scissors in a hand that knows exactly where a nerve runs and is asked to cut just shy of it to keep the face polite. It taught me the music of a quill, inscribing as it was, while the rest of the sentence trembles with as it is and as it might be if we were not cowards. Accuracy precedes understanding. Understanding precedes courage. Courage must learn to arrive late. I can tell you now, in the obstinate rhythm of a man who has memorized his own sentence, that the right is a curriculum for lateness. It grants accuracy a chair, gives understanding a cushion, and keeps courage waiting in the corridor where statues press their faces to the wall and practice breathing. The climax you wanted. Blood, crack. Confession shouted into a microphone. A documentary loves those. Real corrections are quiet. Real violence prefers velvet. The only sound that stayed with me, after the candle went cold and the scissors remembered being asleep, was the small, almost inaudible relief the paper exhaled when we decided not to cut it that second time. It sighed, as if learning there are hours when being left alone is the bravest edit. In this account, the editorial knife is not an instrument of slaughter but of grammar. It trims, it seals, it names yesterday, as if yesterday were a wound that ought to be praised for healing straight. The confessor stands between two rights, binding and refusal, and discovers that rooms can love men into usefulness, and that usefulness can be a chain. I have kept, on my wrist, a circle the winter ring burned there by patience. In the dark, it glows like a bruise that learned to read. If I touch it, I can feel the difference between a seam and a scar. A seam joins two truths and lets them move. A scar announces an injury and pretends to be decoration. The wax in that room leaves scars that want to be mistaken for seams. My hand remembers the heat. The wall remembers the hinge. The city remembers nothing and calls that relief. Tomorrow, because stories love the word, there will be a call, and someone will praise coherence, and someone will move a chalice left or right, and a choir will choose the easier refrain, and a desk will receive a letter from a woman who refuses to let grief be syllabified by men with scissors. Tomorrow, I will decide which rite to perform. Tonight, I am teaching my breath to travel the long corridor between accuracy and courage without stopping to sing the lullabies we wrote to keep fear employed. I left the chamber of corrections with my hands clean and my wrists remembering heat. Clean is an argument the body has with itself. Soap says one thing, the pulse another. The corridor lengthened the way hallways do when they want to reconsider you. I walked past the cupboard of unpronounced things, past the ledger that had accepted our seam, past the door that never quite decides whether it is guarding or inviting. Near the whispering wall, the limestone felt warmer, as if vowels had been pacing behind it and stopped to listen for my steps. This is the place where confessions usually choose spectacle. Here is where the camera loves a face. Here is where the voice raises itself into tribunals and the documentary earns its music. But I promised you a sleep story, and what I have learned is that truth held too high burns, so I will place it low, by the floor where children keep their secrets and old men place their shoes. If you need to sleep, let the vowels be blankets. If you need to wake, listen for the consonants when the room exhales. I did not flee the watchful hours. Fleeing is a choreography men perform when they need the mercy of a chase. I left the way water leaves a cup set too near a window overnight by the small, stubborn patience of evaporation. I copied fewer headings. I oiled fewer chains. I turned the rings, only when the city's hunger would bruise without the mercy of punctual bread. I performed the second right refusal by doing nothing often enough that the building learned my absence as carefully as it had memorized my footsteps. And then one morning, without ceremony, I stood outside the iron gate and did not ask it to know me. The star-bowed key waited in Custos's pocket. He looked at me the way a hinge looks at a door that will not swing today. Late courage, he said. Late, I agreed. And walking, he nodded, which is the only blessing we had ever traded honestly. When you breathe, he said, breathe for two, one for the room, one for yourself. Then he turned and vanished into the grammar of the stairs. I had expected the sky to punish my face for leaving. The sky is generous. It offered an ordinary morning. Pigeons rehearsed their useless advice. A woman argued gently with a vendor who had miscounted change by one coin and was willing to call it providence. A child drew a letter wrong and insisted it was a boat. The city had never needed my courage to continue. That was the first humiliation that felt like grace. For a time I lived only by days, not by feasts, not by rings, days that arrived wet or dusty or full of bread smells. I discovered that clocks do not punish the unfaithful. They merely keep their counsel. I worked in a shop where paper pretended to be simple. Invoices, condolences, small certificates for small lives that wanted, at least once, to see their names inked without the threat of erasure. I became a good listener because listening is what my hands knew how to do. People handed me syllables the way patients hand over wrists. I counted quietly. I did not diagnose. I folded their hours into envelopes and watched them leave, a little taller, as if paper had taught their spines the trick of being columns. Nights were the difficult hours. Sleep is a room with too many doors for men who have known the pleasure of locking them. I heard the chain lullabies in my bones. I felt the winter ring on my wrist, warm when the wind changed. I spoke aloud, sometimes, to the woman whose sixth day had been taught to obey. I cannot return it, I would say to the ceiling, but I can refuse to pretend the seam is a scar. The ceiling forgave me or forgot me. Either is a kind of sleep. I kept the lemon ink ritual, not because secrecy still needed me, but because my body had learned the comfort of sentences returning in candlelight like small resurrections. If memory is a kingdom, borders are drawn with fear. On my skin, the line did not accuse anymore. It instructed. When fear asked for a border, I pressed a palm against it and reminded the skin of the old pasture's smell. Fear is not a god. It is a clerk. It loves a line. Teach your breath to step over. You will want to know whether I told. Telling is a theater where truth wears makeup and hopes the lights are kind. I did something smaller. I made copies, not of pages that would have been a romance I could not afford, but of habits. I taught a baker to keep a second calendar in her head, the one that listens to hunger instead of to chalices that walk left and right. I taught a teacher to let children spell the saint with the stubborn S when their mouths remembered peasant truth, and to mark correct the courage that clung to letters the city had demoted. I taught a clerk to write "as it is" in pencil beside "as it was," and to leave the graphite unerased, because graphite is the conscience of paper. I taught a choir boy to hum both refrains and to love the dissonance as a proof of breath. I did not become a hero. Heroes are easily scheduled. The archive has drawers ready for their jaws. I became an accomplice to your memory that is less pretty and more useful. When you stood before your small kitchen calendar and could not remember whether the market owed you fruit on Wednesday or Thursday, I was the breath behind your ear that said, "Taste the peach," instead of reading it. When the office moved your grief to Monday because Monday has better staffing, I was the slowness in your hand that refused to sign the tidy form. When a ceremony arrived with a face that shone like continuity, I was the unremarkable doubt that asked your nose, "Does the cuff smell right?" Doubt is not disloyalty. It is the immune system of memory. I saw Custos only once more. Years had practiced their arithmetic upon him until the tally resembled a kindness. We met in a church, too plain to tempt a tourist. He sat where his eyes could keep 2 doors in view. "The clock?" I asked. "Still generous," he said. "It forgives hands that learn to tremble." "The presider?" "Still linen." "The woman's parish?" He looked at his palms. "They teach a refrain about love being longer than weeks." He did not apologize for having taught it. He did not defend it. He let the sentence inhabit both chairs, mercy and manipulation. Then he added, like a man admitting a bruise under a sleeve, her priest keeps a second book. He writes anniversaries in pencil. He refuses to erase what the day insists it is. He calls it pastoral redundancy. I call it late courage. We walked the nave like 2 ghosts, rehearsing a scene the living had not paid to watch. Before we parted, he pressed something into my hand, not a key, not a page. Those would have been sentimental, and the Subterranea despises sentimentality in public. It was a wick, ordinary, unprimed. "Choose your candles carefully," he said. "Wax tells on the hand that tips it." We both smiled because we could hear the presider's voice in the warning. Then we stopped smiling because warnings we learned below ground do not survive well in daylight unless we teach them manners. I tell you this now because confession that never turns outward becomes a mirror that eats its own light. Turning outward does not require a parade. It requires you, breathing. It requires a few small practices taught gently enough that no one feels enlisted. I will give you what I can give without turning your room into one of ours. First, keep a notebook of non-events. Not the birthdays and promotions, those have calendars and cakes. Keep the almost happened, the nearly said, the why didn't that bell ring. Scribble when a chalice icon seems to walk from Wednesday to Thursday, and you cannot prove it except by the ache in your knuckles. Sleep beside your small ledger. Wake and read it softly until your mouth learns the old pasture's name again. Second, copy in pencil. When a form insists on as it was, allow your hand the heresy of penciling as it is in the margin. Do not perform the penciling for applause. Do it the way a mother cuts bread unevenly and sets the larger slice quietly at the child's place whose week has been short of grace. Pencils smudge. Smudges are the clouds the Rosicrucian asked us to consider and the crystal the Jesuit asked us to polish. Rain needs both. Third, teach your children the stubborn letters. If the city removes an S, keep it alive in your kitchen. If a saint is transferred to a safer village in the calendar, let your child pin a ribbon by the sink and name it Sanctuary. Do not quarrel with the schoolbook. It is a function, not a face. Give the child 2 names for the day and a nose for the difference. Fourth, accept the second right. You will be asked, politely, to help bind a footnote. The binding will be explained as mercy, coherence, prudence, harmonization. Some days the bread demands it. Feed the city. On other days, blow out the candle. The smell that follows is not myrrh. It is the ordinary smoke of refusal. Open a window. Let the refusal belong to the weather. Fifth, when you hear a bell, ask whose hand taught it the habit. You need not accuse the bell. Bells are innocent of their fame. Asking is a breath practice. Inhale. Accuracy precedes understanding. Exhale. Understanding precedes courage. Pause until the ribs count to late, and let courage arrive with its shoes off. You will object kindly. I hope that such practices do not fix calendars, do not suture phantom centuries, do not unmask ceremonies that smell like the wrong cuff. You are right. This chapter is not an uprising. Uprisings are entries the archive already has drawers for. This chapter is a patient curriculum in immunity. When enough bodies refuse tidy infections, the fever breaks without banners. There is, still, the matter of sleep. You came for a story that would keep watch while your eyes lowered their shields. I have carried you through corridors and clocks and cupboards of letters too long for some pillows. Let me lower the light with you, not as a keeper, but as a witness laying down his gloves. Close your eyes. In the dark, shelves unchain themselves because no visitor will be scandalized by their freedom. Maps stop obeying scissors and remember rivers. The astral clock loosens its rings, the way a tired jaw unclenches. Feast days slide back into the hands that first held them. The whispering wall exhales syllables that sound like the leftover names of children who learned to read by candlelight. Let the syllables be shy. Do not feed them questions. Stand the way Custos taught us, hands behind, head inclined as if listening were a sacrament. Listening is a sacrament. If a corridor appears, narrowed by statues with faces turned into stone, do not take it personally. Those faces were trained to be shy for your comfort. Walk past. If a door offers you its hinge, remember what hinges prefer. Oil, not verdict. Offer attention. Oil is attention warmed by patience. The door will open or it will not. You do not need it tonight. Your room is already a sanctuary because your breath is marking it as one. Should a calendar appear on the inside of your eyelids, and a chalice icon decides to walk a square to the left or right, Smile the way a grandmother smiles at a child rearranging chessmen for the love of motion. The game can wait. The board is a guest in your house, not a landlord. Turn your face toward the window behind your eyes. Morning is a witness, not a judge. If, in your dreaming, a presider in linen arrives with scissors and a stamp and the scent of coherent wax, offer him a chair and no page. Ask him, if you have the kindness, to tell you a story about the first bruise he ever learned to rename. He will talk. Men who live by correction love to recall their origin myths. While he speaks, the candle will forget itself and go out. It is not violence, it is weather. I have left one instruction for last because it has teeth, and I do not wish to wake you. When you wake tomorrow, and you will forget most of this and that is proper, take an object you trust and teach it your name. A spoon, a key, a small stone you found in a pocket of a coat you thought you had lost. Say the name into it, the way a boy whispers into a shell and believes the sea has time for him. Then put the object somewhere you will discover by honest accident in a week. When you find it, let the name return through your skin. Names that return through skin do not report to committees. They report to breath. Our confessor asks for no crusade, no subscription, no proof, only for the geometry of small refusals and small remembrances. The city will call this inconvenience. Administrations will call it noise. It is neither. It is the quiet architecture of a memory that refuses to be scheduled. Do not stop asking. Ask softly and often, like rain that makes stone patient. Do not stop remembering. Remember gently, so that the rooms that love you for your usefulness forget to weaponize your attention. The most dangerous thing for those who rule the archive is not outrage. Outrage is punctual. It prints well. The most dangerous thing is your memory returning, unhurried, unregistered, rhymeless. If you wake in the night and feel for chains, find instead your ribs. Count them as if they were rings on a clock that has resigned from power. When you reach the place where breath pauses to change keys, invite courage in. It will arrive late. It always does. Give it a chair by the window. Teach it to watch without scissor or stamp. I was 19 when I learned the sound a secret makes. I am older now, and the sound has not changed. Paper still exhales when rooms go quiet. The difference is small and complete. I exhale with it, and when the page asks only to be remembered, I do not reach for a seal. I reach for sleep. Good night. Remember gently.